Welcome to America at its Best. My name is Rebecca Painter, and I'll be your host for today's show. You guys have tuned into so many episodes throughout this year of America at its Best to see all of the good things that you're making possible through your partnership with State Policy Network. But we cannot possibly end the year without addressing some of the best news, not only of 2020, but of the last 4 years. And that, my friend, is the current makeup of our Supreme Court. Today, the leader of State Policy Network, Tracy Sharp, is going to join me for a conversation with a man who some have said have more influence over judicial appointments than any other person outside of the government. Others call him the Supreme Court Whisperer. He has worked closely with President Trump over the last 4 years to make sure the nominations for federal judges are the right ones. Ladies and gentlemen, in a moment, we are going to welcome to the show a man who is a close strategic partner to State Policy Network and our friend, Leonard Leo. But first, I'd like to turn it over to Tracy Sharp to check in and just ask you, Tracy, in your view, why was it so important that we had Leonard join us for the show today?
Hello, Rebecca. It's great to see you again. I've been looking forward to this episode because, as you say, Leonard has been a key strategic partner for State Policy Network. And for me personally, over the years, to be able to connect with him for advice and guidance, especially to help us navigate a rapidly changing political landscape. It's also been helpful for us to align our strategies and sharpen them alongside with those strategies of our allies, which helps multiply our efforts. So I was looking forward to this episode and seeing our friend Leonard.
Great. Well, let's welcome Leonard to the show. Leonard, hi. It's great to see you.
I think got the mute on.
Still on mute.
There we go.
Hey, Leonard. Yeah. Has that snowstorm hit there on the East Coast yet?
Hasn't hit us yet up here in Maine, but we're expecting it tomorrow. So good to be here, though. And Tracy, thank you so much for your leadership at SPN. It's a great network, and you've done an incredible job leveraging it in so many ways. It's great to be a part of what you do, a small part of what you do, and to have your friendship.
Oh, thank you, Leonard. We get a lot of help from the experts like you. So Rebecca, take it away.
All right, well, let's get started. Leonard, it's no secret that you know the secret sauce in terms of making sure we've got the right people sitting on benches all across the country. Can you just start by telling us why the focus on the courts have been so important the last few years and will be moving into 2021?
Well, the focus on the court's is important because the court has such an enormous impact on so many different facets of American life. The court really started becoming an extremely important and central part of American life in the 1950s, and it really hasn't changed much since. And so if what you care about is the growth of government or religious freedom or property rights or the scope of the regulatory state or campaign finance or civil rights or any other number of other issues, the court's going to be one of the central places where decisions are going to be made in a way that's going to impact you. And so not being a part of that game, not being a part of the court's game, takes you out of a really important part of circulation in American public policy and American public life.
Yeah, it's clear that the courts game and the game in the states are critical to seeing impact moving forward. Tracy, how have you seen the impact of the courts in our state work over the years?
Oh, well, for sure that the role of the courts has increased in the states, which is why it's been especially important for us to grow these litigation centers. There are fully 15 state-based litigation centers that have been started by state think tanks. And I think a recent example of why this capacity is so important in the states is that these litigation centers have been the organized resistance to help curb some of these emergency powers, to push back against some governors to necessitate what is needed in terms of legislative oversight and to insert some more accountability. It protects civil liberties of the people of those states. So that's one example of many where these litigation centers can help protect and create a stronger muscle and capacity overall in the states, working with the state think tanks.
Thanks, Tracy. No doubt the network's litigation centers have been able to stop governors from shutting down entire state economies with no check and balance. Leonard, in that same spirit of thinking about appointments, so the recent appointments that President Trump has made, have they already changed the direction of the courts? Are we already seeing evidence of that, or will it be a while before we really feel the impact?
We're starting to see some evidence of that. I mean, certainly we're starting to see already an increased use in originalism, a more rigorous use of textualism. So those two jurisprudential tools continue to be on the rise at the Supreme Court. We're already seeing in some areas like religious freedom a shift in the court's jurisprudence. We've seen a little bit of that as well in the area of scrutiny of the regulatory state. So I would say that Justices Gorsuch, Kavanaugh, and Barrett have already started to make their presence felt.
Okay. And I have to ask, what was it like working with President Trump?
Well, you know, he cared very deeply about this issue and was very engaged on it and very passionate about it. I'll always remember the first really important meeting we had after the election. It was a week after the election. In fact, I think Tracy and I were both down in Charleston, South Carolina at a philanthropy roundtable meeting the day before it. And I'll always remember that meeting. It was about an hour and 15 minutes long. And it was really where he laid out his vision of, you know, what sort of criteria he wanted in the judges and in the justices he was going to appoint. He was very engaged, very inquisitive, and very determined. And I think that that's evidenced by the kind of success he's had over the past 4 years.
All right. And so as you worked closely with President Trump and made recommendations for the next Supreme Court justices, what were the most important factors that you took into account when making those recommendations?
Well, believe it or not, the most important factor is courage. Or as the president would put it, he wanted justices and judges who were, quote, not weak. That's what he used to say. And the reason why that's so important is because you can be the smartest guy in the world. You can know everything that one needs to know about any area of the law. But if you don't have a stiff spine, if you don't have the courage to do the right thing in this particular cultural milieu, you know, things are going to go south. And that's what we've seen over the years. The Supreme Court building does weird things to people, and you have to have independence, courage to really, you know, stick to your guns and to do what's right. Now, that's not to say smarts isn't important, but it's important not just for the obvious reason, which is you want to get it right, you want to get the answers right. It's also important because when you're intellectually at the top of your game, you're less likely to be snookered by dumb arguments on the other side. So it's that combination of courage and the soundness of judgment that intellectual caliber gives, which I think are two of the most important things. And from that, I think one, you know, rationally develops a judicial philosophy grounded in originalism, textualism, the importance of the structural constitution to human dignity and individual freedom.
Do you ever worry that despite courage and the other things you just mentioned, that one of your recommendations perhaps would fail you and not stand up to the commitment to the Constitution that you expect them to?
Well, you always worry about jurists. They're human by their nature. They're capable of virtue as well as folly and vice. And we've seen that every once in a while in certain instances up at the Supreme Court and the lower federal court. So sure, you worry about it. look, the process is only as good as human character. At the end of the day, you can do everything, everything you possibly can to ensure the best possible nominees, the people with the highest character, the best records. But ultimately, these are human beings, and they can make mistakes, and they can have lapses in character and determination and courage. So you worry about it, but you just do the best you can.
I would add, Rebecca, that the work that Leonard has done over the years at the Federalist Society and elsewhere to really build up the bench of talent, like what we've done here in this network, the bench of young talent coming up that has that intestinal fortitude and the training and the experience and smarts that create a stronger future for us of leaders. It's a very important capacity as well.
Absolutely. We've had 2 consecutive presidential campaigns coinciding with the deaths of Supreme Court justices. Leonard, will future nominations continue to be doomed by this contentious battle going forward, or was anything learned from the last 2?
I think these will be knock them down, drag them out fights for the rest of our professional lives and beyond. And really, that's just a function of the role that the court plays in our society. If they're going to have the kind of outsized role that they do, it's inevitable that presidents and senates are going to make these court picks, particularly Supreme Court picks, as significant and consequential as they are politically. So I think that's here to stay. And it's just really a matter of girding up and fighting the good fight when you need to.
Is there anything you think we should be doing to improve the confirmation process in our country?
Well, we're not the ones that need to do something. It's the left and the Democrats. They've corrupted the process by turning it into a political charade. And this is a problem that dates all the way back to 1985, when they first started messing around with the Senate rules, engaging in obstructionist tactics, engaging in the politics of personal destruction. We've done everything we can to play by the rules, and what we're doing now is just accepting the rules as they've laid them out. And playing by that game. And it's unfortunate, but they're the ones that are going to have to right the process, since they destroyed it in the first place. And I don't see that happening anytime soon, as you saw from the last election cycle with threats of court packing and so forth. So,
well, and you mentioned the other side. We just had a great question come in from a viewer. Do you see the other side now investing and focusing on building kind of an anti-Fed SOC of sorts?
Well, they've been trying that for a few years. They've launched a couple of organizations to try to be more aggressive in the judicial selection and confirmation space, to create their own pipelines for the judiciary. And it's unclear whether that is going to have any meaningful impact. It didn't really make itself felt very significantly during the Obama administration. But they're certainly devoting more resources to it. And I think we need to be prepared for the possibility that they begin to take this game even more seriously, sort of at the grassroots and political levels. Yeah.
Yeah, Leonard, I'm curious. The reason the Federal Society has been so successful is it's organic. It's a bottom up, based on local needs, where attorneys and legal scholars can align locally, instead of a top down, heavy handed managed. And I wonder if that's a reason why the left has a hard time starting something that they can't control from the top down. It's certainly a big reason why this state-based network of think tanks has been so successful, is because they're all, we say, fiercely independent. So do you attribute a lot of the Federal Society's success to that organic bubbling up nature?
You know, it's funny you mentioned that, Tracy, because I'm sure you've seen this in package pieces and profile stories written about SPN, just as the way we've seen it in stories written about the Federalist Society and our dark money empire. You know, they don't really understand how it works, right? Because they don't really understand freedom and decentralization. So they think it's just, you know, Tracy Sharp and Leonard Leo sort of, you know, controlling the orbit of the planets. When in reality, it is a completely organic system. It's an infrastructure or network of people who get to know each other, who become bonded in lots of different ways. And there isn't that kind of top-down control, even though that's the way the mainstream media and the left like to portray it. So all you're doing is creating a community that other people see and recognize the value of and want to obtain value out of. And you know, that's all it is. And it's not to say there aren't some leaders in the movement who play a bigger role than others, but it is a very decentralized, as SPN is. It's a very decentralized effort and movement, the conservative legal movement and the judicial aspect of it in particular.
Well, and it's the very thing that decentralization, the organic nature of it, that makes it relevant and responsive to solving problems on the ground, and not just solving problems, but turning opportunities into results. So it's very much the secret sauce that makes it successful. So
You bet.
Yeah, great points. And, you know, to that end, we saw as a result of all of these efforts, there was not a blue wave that came in the 2020 elections at the state level. Leonard, do you see a potential blue wave ahead of us in terms of judges coming our way in the next 4 years?
Well, that's not clear. If you look at the most obvious vacancies on lots of the U.S. courts of appeals around the country, many of the most obvious vacancies are actually Democrat or liberal appointees. So it's not clear to me that in the first 4 years of a Biden administration, there would be a significant flip in the composition of most of our circuits. And you can kind of say the same thing at the U.S. Supreme Court level. I mean, I think Stephen Breyer is the next most one of the older members of the court, but again, you wouldn't see an ideological flip if he retired. So it's not clear yet that you'll see the kind of transformative activity you saw during the Trump administration. I mean, remember, he was handed a very unique set of circumstances. I mean, there were, I forget how many vacancies now, but I think there were over 200 vacancies or close to it when he took office. It was an unprecedented number of vacancies. And there were a very large number of appointees who were moderate to liberal, who were either vacating their seats already or retiring. So I don't see that replicating itself. There might be a circuit or two that gets worse on the left side of the equation, like the DC circuit, but I don't see a significant shift in the court, at least in the first several years.
Okay, and how many vacancies are there left to fill between now and the end of the year?
Not many.
Okay.
There are no. I believe there is one Court of Appeals vacancy, and a handful of district court vacancies where there are nominees, but no confirmation yet. It's a small number relative to what it historically has been.
Okay. For weeks, every time I turned on the TV, I was hearing buzz about court packing. How real of a threat is that now?
Well, it's hanging out there. It's you know it's less of a threat, obviously, if the Democrats do not have control of the Senate. And I even think with a 50-50 Senate, it would be very hard for the Democrats to get it done, because I think the Republicans could just refuse to provide a quorum. And that's something I don't think that the president of the Senate, the vice president, could break. So I think it's hard, if very hard at this juncture, for the Democrats to do it. But that doesn't mean they won't try, and try to sort of gin up their coalition by making an issue out of it. I hope they don't. I mean, it's one thing to contort the Senate rules and to sort of abuse the process in the Senate. That's not great, but those are rules of convenience, rules of collegiality. They're customs, and practices, but it's different when you statutorily change the composition of the court and begin to very formally view the court as basically a political institution that is a function of the men and women who serve on it and their own political predispositions. I mean, those justices wear black robes for a reason. They wear black robes because it's meant to symbolize that what their personal beliefs are, what their predispositions are politically or personality wise, don't matter. And unfortunately, I think court packing sends the opposite kind of message to the American people. So I really hope that everybody resists the temptation to engage that debate. It is a wildly unpopular proposal. If you look at any of the polling that's been done, we've done some polling as well, at least 58% of the American people do not favor it. So I think it would not only be wrong to pursue it, I think it could very well be a failed enterprise, and would be, I think, pretty unpopular.
Good. That's good news to hear. We've had quite a few questions in the chat around election integrity. There were some key decisions that came down last week. So Leonard, what's next in the courts on this issue?
Well, electoral integrity is always going to be an issue at the court. I mean, there are lots of proposals that have been floating around to extend the franchise, to scale back some of the processes that historically have been in place to ensure voter integrity. I have no doubt that some of those controversies will continue to make their way to the court. But what we have to remember is that at the end of the day, two things. One, a lot of these issues of voter and electoral integrity are state issues, okay, not really federal issues. There is sort of a broad federal interest in some of this, but it's fairly narrow and fairly limited, and federal courts are going to be very hesitant to get extremely involved. Not to mention the fact that it's very hard to craft post-election remedies. So courts are wary to get involved in this because of those two things. But secondly, we have to remember that at the end of the day, a lot of the credit or blame for the existence or lack of electoral integrity really lies at the feet of state legislatures. I mean, at the end of the day, just take a look at the past election we just been through. At the end of the day, at the front end, pre-election, it was state legislatures that bore responsibility for deciding what kinds of processes to put in place to ensure the integrity of the electoral process in a very unique period of time. And post-election, it is the duty of the state legislatures to exercise their will if they feel something has been amiss. And so at the end of the day, people should be asking questions of state legislatures like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, they're the ones that should be asked questions about, what happened, or why, what should happen going forward, because that's ultimately where most of the authority resides.
Yeah, Tracy, state legislatures are clearly in SPN's wheelhouse. So what do you have to say to that?
Well, that's a great point. I mean, several leaders in this network have engaged on this issue, in part because they feel such a responsibility to the people of their states, and to really spur on these legislatures to not shirk duties. And there's laws on the books already that need to be enforced. So I think a productive lane that several leaders are working with election experts on is a set of best practices and reforms that can be instituted and enforced in a given state, just to protect the integrity of the vote count process itself. So I think that's a very productive lane that a lot of our leaders are engaging on, and that needs going to grow for sure.
Okay, thanks. Well, we've had a few questions in the chat and comments pointing to not only Leonard's commitment and great work at the federal level, but also talking about what you've done in the state courts and at the federal appellate level as well. Leonard, can you talk to us a little bit about what state level legal battles that you see as most significant into the future, and how these changes in lower courts might affect some policy at the state level?
Sure. Well, there's no shortage of battles at the state level. I think that you've seen some of this in the midst of the current COVID crisis, with the scope of emergency powers on the part of governors, separation of powers issues at the state level. Under what circumstances must a state legislature act as opposed to a governor or a regulatory body at state level? I think we've seen an increase in those kinds of state level separation of powers disputes. We haven't seen those in quite a while, and we'll start seeing those again. I think you're seeing an increase in religious freedom cases at the state level. There was a time when you saw a lot of those at the local level with zoning boards and so forth, but I think now you're starting to see challenges to state governments as well as local governments in that area, which is a slightly different development. And so those are all areas that I think are quite ripe for review. There are a number of cases coming down the pike in the freedom of expression area beyond religion. Campaign finance, various aspects of political speech and restrictions that states are placing on that. So those are a few of the areas where I think you'll see an uptick in litigation, sometimes in state courts that reach state Supreme Courts, sometimes directly in the federal system.
Tracy, do you see any overlap there? And when you talk with CEOs of litigation centers across the country, where there are more things brewing in our network around some of those specific topics?
Oh, for sure, regulatory overreach and reining in these emergency powers and creating more systems of accountability and checks and balances. Those issues alone have kept these litigation centers busy. But Leonard also mentioned several First Amendment issues. It's just interesting how much this network has stepped up to fill that void. It used to be such a more of a center-left component to protect free speech. But now we are more the protectors of, free minds, free markets, free speech, freedom of expression and association. I think there's a growing role for that of our litigation centers and the think tanks in the states to protect that.
Okay. And Leonard, I just want to tell you, everyone who's asking questions are also thanking you for everything that you've been doing over the years. There's a lot of love coming your way. Dan Peters has asked a question from Cincinnati, and he mentioned that in Ohio, judges are all elected but not identified by party. Now that the judicial process has become so political, what are your thoughts on identifying candidates by party?
I've never had any objection to having what we call partisan elections for state court judges, which is to say the party identification is there. Look, I mean, party identification at the state level is one of a number of different factors for trying to ascertain, where someone generally lies philosophically or ideologically. I don't think party affiliation is relevant at that level for public policy purposes, what particular political positions a prospective judge might have. But both parties at the state levels often do have opinions about the proper role of the courts. And so I don't have any objection to partisan identification. I think it does at some level provide some voter education. And also, frankly, I think it does increase public participation in the judicial elections process.
Okay. Let's go back to an earlier question when you were pointing out some of the cases that are about to be heard closer to the state level. Tracy mentioned we've got about 15 state-based litigation centers all over the country. Tracy and Leonard, we'll have Leonard answer first, and Tracy, I'd like you to weigh in. Is 15 enough? Do we need more of them? What role could they play? How could things change if we really muscled up even more in that area?
Well, I would defer to Tracy, of course, on how many are enough and where they would be needed. I would say this. I mean, there's no question in my mind that there are really important issues at the state level to deal with that ought to find their way into the courts. Some of those issues are really pure state law questions. Some of them are federal. But we've seen where a state litigation group emerges, that there's a lot of value added and a lot of purpose to it. I mean, to give you just one or two examples, I mean, the Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty in Wisconsin is a fairly recent vintage, and they have taken on a very significant docket. The Illinois Policy Institute has ramped up its litigation activity in significant ways. So we've seen where state policy groups start to get involved in the litigation game. There is demand for their work and efforts. I think the big question is always, well, where do what states do you want to plant those flags in? That's a tough call. I think clearly in states where we have state Supreme Courts now that are more sympathetic to limited constitutional government, we should be planting flags in those states because you have a sympathetic state high court. In states now where you have federal benches that might be open to claims, those are places to plant flags. It's a tougher question if you're in a state where the state and federal bench are kind of a wasteland, and there it's hard to know whether it's a great investment of resources. It would depend upon what the what the trade-offs would be, and that would be something that Tracy would have much greater expertise at addressing.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think some sort of legal capacity, litigation capacity in each state is necessary to protect market-oriented legislation that gets passed and then runs the risk of getting gutted, or to resist against legislation or other rules by agencies that impose on people's rights and disempower people. So some sort of litigation capacity is part of that, really a free market movement in each state, part of that balanced breakfast of the think tank with the intellectual capacity, intellectual ammunition, investigative litigation, C4 grassroots. So in that regard, every state could use some sort of capacity. Now, I do know of these 15 litigation centers, they're growing rapidly. So there's a lot of overlap that they can add in other states too and be helpful. So it's a growing capacity. It's one that's learning too to communicate and share ideas with each other too. That helps sharpen them and pick good cases with good facts, so that we have good precedents. I think a lot of thought has to go into that as well. So we welcome it as part of growing that capacity, that durable infrastructure in each state.
Okay, thanks. And final question from the audience. Biden, like Obama, will probably use a lot of executive orders and agency powers. At the same time, it looks like our Supreme Court is signaling that it wants to curtail agency power. So how do you expect this to play out, Leonard?
Well, I think that's going to be one of the really interesting areas of Supreme Court litigation. The scope of the regulatory state and the extent to which the judiciary has the power to review the determinations of these agencies. There are a lot of very interesting separation of powers questions about the scope of agency authority. There are a lot of very interesting questions about the obligation of the judiciary to scrutinize agency action and not simply roll over and play dead. There are a lot of interesting questions about the balance of power between the national government and its regulatory states vis-a-vis the states, and how that plays out. I think all of those issues are on the table in a way they haven't been before. I think Justices Thomas and Gorsuch in particular have expressed a real willingness to scale back some of the traditional, well, I don't know how traditional they are, post-1980s deference doctrines that took courts out of the business of really looking at these structural constitutional issues and questions of statutory construction and so forth. Some of the law has just been crazy. The idea that you defer to an agency's interpretation of its own jurisdiction just seems to me to fly in the face of the concept of checks and balances. So I think this is going to be an area of real growth in terms of the court's docket, and because the court has on its bench at this point a number of originalists who really understand the relationship between enforcing the structural limits on government power in the Constitution and the preservation of freedom and dignity, who really understand that connection between those two things. I think these cases will continue to emerge and will be an important part of the court's docket.
Okay, thank you, Leonard. Any final thoughts, Leonard, before we go? Leonard and Tracy, we'll let Leonard go first.
Well, I think my only final thought would be that, as we move into 2021, the work of SPN is of even greater importance. What we saw during the Obama years was that the states were an important backstop when it came to efforts to engage in federal overreach. And that will be no different in the next several years. And so I think that the institutions you stand up, the relationships you develop between your institutions and key leaders in the states, governors, attorneys general, secretaries of state, and so forth, all of that is really quite important when you have an executive branch in Washington that will not feel as constrained by the structural constitution. So the work that you're going to be embarking on beginning in late January is going to be really important.
Yeah, I would just close by saying that the partnerships that we have with allies, like what that Leonard has worked with through Federalist Society and a broad network that he's involved with, this helps us really face these political realities, to really understand with eyes wide open heading into the new year of what it's going to take to not only hold ground, but to gain ground from market-oriented ideas. So for that, we're grateful for this time with Leonard today to be able to gain these insights and to work as partners out in the states. I think ultimately it's powerful because at the end of the day, the Constitution is still on our side, right? We have that as one of the greatest tools in our tool belt to be able to protect market ideas and the role the founders had for the states, for state legislatures, for how elections are run, to make sure they're run with integrity and that they're reliable, accountable, and transparent. So we have a lot to look forward to. We have a lot of work ahead, but it helps to have key experts at our side to be able to work together and multiply our efforts. So thanks again, Leonard. We appreciate all you do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Leonard. Thank you, Tracy. You heard it here first. The courts in the states are where it's at in 2021. Really appreciate you guys joining us today. And to those of you who've been tuning in all year long, you've been the best part of 2020. We've been able to bring you good news because you've been making good things happen through this challenging, crazy year. You guys are the reason that we were able to stop governors from just closing down their states and shutting down their state economies, stopping people from working. You guys are the reason that more healthcare was deregulated in 14 days than in the last decade. And you guys are the reason that we've got such a strong muscle of litigation centers within this network moving in to 2021, where it's going to be so important. So thank you. Here's some more good news. It's not going to end just because the year's over. There's going to be more good news coming. So we will be back in January with America at its best to keep the good news coming. So thanks for all you do. Thank you for your partnership and support, and have a wonderful Christmas and holiday. We will see you next year. Thanks, everybody.
Take care.